Unmute. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are presenting Overlook the Ignorance, Jewish Americans, Anti-Semitism, and the Second World War with Dr. Miriam Mora. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I will be your moderator today. The Jewish Heritage Center collects, preserves, and illuminates the Jewish history of New England and beyond to educate a wide audience about Jewish contributions to our world. We are located in Boston at New England Historic Genealogical Society, also known as American Ancestors, America's founding genealogical organization. Today, we will be learning about the American Jewish experience of anti-Semitism during World War II, both on the battlefront and on the home front. But before we get started, I just want to make a couple of notes about this webinar. You in the audience are automatically muted. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can following Dr. Mora's presentation. Also, as we are broadcasting from different locations today, we ask you to bear with us if we experience any technological issues. Even if there are glitches on our end or on yours, you will receive a link to the full recording of this session to watch later. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today. Dr. Miriam Mora is the inaugural historian in residence at the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center, a position generously funded by supporter Richard Schilder. Dr. Mora is also the director of academic and public programs at the Center for Jewish History in New York. She holds her doctorate in immigration and ethnic history, specializing in Jewish American acculturation, ethnicity, and gender. She has published several articles and anthology chapters, and her forthcoming book, Carrying a Big Shtick, American Jewish Acculturation and Masculinity in the 20th Century, has just won the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award from the Association for Jewish Studies, and it will be released by Wayne State University Press next winter. Dr. Mora has brought important historical insight and analysis to the history in the Jewish Heritage Center's archives, and it is such a pleasure to work with her and to learn from her. So without further ado, welcome Miriam Mora.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the introduction, and thank you to the Jewish Heritage Center for this opportunity to speak with all of you today, and for all of you to take the time to be here and listen. It's been a privilege to serve as the first inaugural historian in residence at this organization, which has been a productive and totally delightful experience. And I hope that all of you with any interest in the topics that we discussed today, or Jewish history in New England, or in general, find the time to pay a visit to the Jewish Heritage Center and spend some time in their wonderful collections, poring over and sifting through the various treasures that are housed there. The goal of my lecture today is not to talk about the Second World War itself, or about the history of the Holocaust or Jewish persecution. My goal is to share with you all some of the insights that I've gleaned in the archives into the experiences of everyday Americans during the war and their interactions with anti-Semitism from their fellow countrymen. It's a remarkable thing that even while engaged in a war against fascism and in many ways fighting to end Hitler's war against the Jews of Europe, anti-Semitism in the United States persisted nearly unabated. Negative attitudes towards Jews in the US were simply not seen as incompatible with the belief that Hitler needed to be stopped. And in many cases, America's entry into the war served only to strengthen negative assumptions about Jews in America, as I'll demonstrate over the next hour with you all. American Jews at the start of the Second World War were in a distinctly different position than that in the first or in any previous American conflict, as there was a clear Jewish interest in American participation in the war in Europe. America didn't join the war in order to fight for or protect the Jews of Europe, But the war did have a Jewish element which couldn't be overlooked, even before the full extent of atrocities against Jews in Europe was common knowledge. Joining the war effort meant fighting for the United States, though it tangentially included a fight for Jewish interests and protection worldwide. This meant that in addition to the preconceived notions of Jewish unsuitability to military service, which I'll be discussing, Jews both in and outside of the service faced accusations of dual loyalty, an old and frequently believed adage against Jews in America and elsewhere. And they were often blamed for America's entry into the war, or at least into the European theater. In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about two areas in which Jewish Americans encountered anti-Semitism in the lead up to and during the Second World War, in American wartime political and social environments, and from within and from American armed forces. Excuse me. During the period between the world wars, America experienced a rise in anti-Semitic publications, hate groups, and popular figures. I'm going to get into some of those, but I want to start from the ground up in the everyday experiences of American Jews. After the First World War, American Jews faced discrimination in countless venues, including educational quotas in colleges and prep schools, discrimination in professions, restrictions from residential communities, and even acts of violence. Even pretty mainstream parts of American societies like universities, hotels, clubs, gyms, fraternities, resorts, and other associations denied membership to Jews. You can see such a sign here from a club in Maryland specifically limiting both members and guests to Gentiles of North European ancestry. And it gets into more of the details lower in the text, though I'm not sure how large all of your screens are. Pulling from the collections at the Wyner Jewish Heritage Center, you can also see from the bottom image, though it's just text, that there's Jewish housing and employment exclusion across Boston, marking of Jewish application to various Boston area colleges to try and limit Jewish entry, and the infamous but openly acknowledged restrictive quota on the portion of Jewish students allowed admitted to each class at Harvard University, introduced in 1922 by then Harvard President A. Lawrence Lowell. A large element of increasing anti-Semitism in the lead up to the Second World War was due to the Bolshevik Revolution and assumptions of its Jewish origins. You can see on the right an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish Bolshevik in New York City. In addition, the dissemination of the fictional Protocols of the Elders of Zion, first published in 1903 in Russia, spread theories and beliefs about Jewish global conspiracies to every nation in which it was republished, including the United States. It wasn't only institutional anti-Semitism that was on the rise in this period. Mob violence against other social and religious minorities increased during and after World War I as Americans became more resentful of foreign nations. Americans of all sorts were panicked about the possible spread of communism, but many unfairly associated it with Jews, in spite of much American Jewish condemnation of communism. And I discussed this more at length in a previous lecture here last month, which if you didn't attend, you're welcome to view online at the Jewish Heritage Center website. The most famous popular anti-Semitic figure in the United States, arguably, was Henry Ford. He republished and distributed the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion in the United States after it had been brought to the States by a Russian anti-communist, helping tremendously to popularize the belief in a global Jewish financial conspiracy among American citizens. If you could advance to the next slide. In addition, in his own paper, The Dearborn Independent, he wrote and published a regular piece, later compiled and printed in bound editions, called The International Jew. His influence was tremendous in the United States and beyond, and his publications reached millions of people. In addition, Ford helped to finance Hitler, who praised the International Jew in his own memoir, Mein Kampf, and offered him help and support in various ways beyond. And though Ford did publicly apologize to the American Jewish community for his anti-Semitic publications before the Second World War started in 1927, he didn't fulfill his promise to halt their circulation. And the damage that he did, even if his apology had been sincere, was irreparable. I also include here an image of Father Charles Coughlin on the right, the radio priest, who broadcast weekly from a studio in Michigan in the decades preceding World War II. And he reached about 15 million listeners a week. between him and Coughlin, or him and Ford, both railing against Jews, calling them accusing them of exerting undue influence on the American government. They helped to cement the link in the minds of many between Jews and Bolshevism, particularly the Red Scare fears of American Jews secretly working to bring communist ideas to the United States. By the mid-30s, fascist movements from across Europe and their rhetoric were echoing into the social and political fabric of the United States. Anti-Semitic groups became more active and open as Americans saw an increase in physical attacks on American Jews. The center picture here is of Fritz Julius Kuhn, the leader of the German-American Bund, an openly Nazi-supporting American group which parroted Nazi rhetoric about Jews to all Americans who would listen. Indeed, before America joined the war, American Nazi groups openly supported Hitler and fascism as it was manifesting across Europe. Though their support died down after their own country went to war with Hitler, the support in the mid to late 30s was very real and very vocal. They saw fascism as wholly compatible with American ideals. In the picture on the left, above a huge crowd of American Nazi supporters, you can see a giant banner down there on the stage of George Washington, sandwiched between huge swastikas and American flags, showing just how compatible they thought American history and a fascist future really were. This picture was taken on February 20th, 1939, when American Nazis gathered for a rally at Madison Square Garden in New York, organized by the German-American Bund, one of several such groups in the United States that supported fascism and Hitler. They opened the rally with the Pledge of Allegiance, with 20,000 people reciting it while raising their hands in a Nazi salute. Speakers took to the stage and denounced Jews as homeless parasites, not real Americans, and denounced Roosevelt, though they called him Rosenfeld, as under their financial control. Trying to tie Nazi ideology to American nation-making mythology, they talked about the founding fathers' vision for a white America, explaining that racial mixing was something that the white founders would never have tolerated, and that these massive waves of immigrants that had come to the United States over the preceding decades were nothing like what they envisaged as the American future. Perhaps the people who are saying this themselves were unaware of Benjamin Franklin's own detestation of Christian German immigrants in his day. Outside of this rally, there were thousands of protesters, and inside, one Jewish man, Isidor Greenbaum, who's pictured on the right here, leapt on stage and denounced Hitler. He was beaten, arrested, and fined for public disturbance. The reason I mention him and his outburst was that after this event, and perhaps because of it, he enlisted in the Navy to fight as a Jew for America. And I want to open this next part of our discussion with which I'm going to talk about military experiences of American Jews with a quote from the book on the left, titled Jews Fight Too, which was published in the midst of the Second World War. Quote, Jews fight too. Perhaps they do not fight any better, nor more heroically than any other people, but certainly no less bravely do they fight, unquote. The statement is actually a really defensive one. It's born out of assumptions of the Jewish character held for centuries and not diminished by Jews fighting for America in the several wars and expeditions in the decades preceding it. It's a defense that most ethnic and religious groups in the United States have never felt the need to put out for themselves, but which Jews have repeatedly felt the need to reiterate and publicize. And the reason for this defensive attitude during World War II was complex, but the primary component was the centuries-old assumption about Jews that they're physically weak, conflict and battle averse, and value brains over brawn to the point of diminished physical strength among the entire Jewish population. Jews already had a long history of these accusations in and around the American armed forces. During the First World War, for example, it was so common a belief that Jews evaded military service that the instruction manual for the Medical Advisory Board of the draft stated that, quote, the foreign-born, especially the Jews, are more apt to malinger than the native-born, unquote. And during that first war, Jews had fought against such accusations and had managed to convince the armed forces to amend the offending medical instruction manual. So they had made some positive progress, particularly through the efforts of the Jewish War Veterans, which was established in 1896. Even into the Second War, rumors of draft dodging were common. There was in 1942 even a demonstration in front of a New York Selective Service Board accusing a specific Jewish doctor of giving Jewish boys, quote, some kind of injection affecting their hearts for draft evasion purposes, unquote. But really, Jews didn't evade service, and certainly not in their history in the United States. Approximately 550,000 self-identifying Jewish men and women served in the American Armed Forces during the Second World War, accounting for between 4 to 5% of the soldiers serving in the United States in total. And in 1940, Jews constituted 3.6% of the total American population, showing that Jewish participation was in fact higher than their proportion of the population. Jews entered the war as American citizens and patriots, just like any other ethnic, religious, or migrant group. But accusations of Jewish cowardice still cropped up, at times even in national leadership. A congressman speaking in front of the House Military Affairs Committee, for example, believed that Jews would not willingly fight and argued that those who inevitably tried to escape their service should not be allowed to go, quote, scot-free. Working against Jews, making the point of Jewish valor and patriotism, was the support of this old canard in contemporary behavior. There were Jews volunteering, certainly, but there were also others, the religious community primarily, who did not want to fight and who voiced their preferences publicly. As committed pacifists, they argued that religious men should not be punished for refusing to join up or answer the call of the draft. Among themselves, American Jews debated whether voluntary exclusion should be allowed for religious Jewish men. Though this wasn't necessarily intentional, by arguing for the rights of Jews to avoid military service on the grounds of religious belief, Jewish leaders helped to perpetuate the views of Jews as timid or even cowardly. In 1936, the Central Conference of American Rabbis adopted a resolution seeking exemption of Jews from military service, quote, in accordance with the highest interpretation of Judaism, unquote. This pronouncement met with immense backlash from the Jewish community, particularly from Jewish veterans from the First World War, who viewed this pronouncement as a slap in the face, not only to their service to their country, but also to their service in the image of American Jewry and Jewish American men. The National Intelligence the National Intelligence Officer for the Jewish War Veterans wrote in response to this resolution that American Jews were painfully shocked by this pronouncement. In fact, there was another recommendation for a resolution, which after much debate was not passed at the convention, for the Central Conference of American Rabbis to adopt the stance that Jewish leadership should urge the, quote, uniform continuance of nonviolent resistance to evil as a basic principle of Jewish life, unquote. And this is a particularly weighted statement given the plight of European Jews at the time. Many felt that passivity was fundamentally negligent at that time. Shortly after the resolution, and an article which I've pictured here that was drawing attention to it in the New York Times titled "War Duty Exemption for All Jews Urged," the Jewish war veterans adopted a resolution of their own, firmly against this stance, staunchly reaffirming the heroic record of Jewish fighters. They said, quote, categorically, we deny that fighting for one's country is inconsistent with the highest interpretation of Judaism. We deny that patriotism is to be confused with militarism. We deny the right of any Jew to exemption on religious grounds. We deny that patriotic veterans love peace any less than do self-styled pacifists. JWV stands for Shalom with honor. In one fell stroke, they wrote, do these rabbis give credence and support to the charge that the Jew is a pacifist and a cowardly avoider of the obligations of citizenship, unquote. Regardless of growing anti-Semitism and of the option to refuse military service as a conscientious objector, the Second World War showed no decline in Jewish participation in the military, and enlisting wasn't always easy for Jews who wanted to fight. Several volunteers fought anti-Semitism in recruiting offices just to be allowed to enlist. It's a common misconception that high levels of Jews enlisting to fight for the US in World War II was a rare or spectacular occurrence. This is partially due to the fact that many Americans at the time viewed Jews as being personally invested in the outcome of the war in Europe. And it's also a misconception about American Jews that serving in the Second World War was a purely unifying experience, which slashed away at anti-Semitic feeling in the military. Certainly, some Jewish soldiers felt that their lives in the military were less likely to contain anti-Semitism than civilian life because of the fraternal bonds formed by serving with their comrades in arms. And indeed, service alongside Jewish Americans did dispel some of the more common anti-Semitic myths, such as the belief that all Jews have physical horns, for example, but the more subtle ones about Jewish frailty and cowardice persisted. Through my research at the Wyner Center archives, I've been fortunate enough to explore the collections of several of these Jewish soldiers, and in one case, an entire family, which really demonstrates several different perspectives on American military experiences with anti-Semitism. So I'm going to kind of use them as a guide to go through some of the experiences of Jews in and around the service as we move forward. So I'd like here to introduce you to the Gorfinkel family, whose treasure trove of correspondence are worth a look for anyone with the time and inclination, as are many of the other soldiers' correspondence from several American wars and conflicts in the collections. The left picture is Bernard Gorfinkel, who served in the Mexican expedition that the United States undertook in 1916 against revolutionary leader Pancho Villa, and then both world wars for the American Army, though in a more bureaucratic position in the latter. His son Herbert is center, who served in the Second World War, and his daughter Ruth, who, though not in the service, had her own telling interactions with American soldiers, is on the right. He also had a younger daughter, Sarah, who I'll mention a little bit later on, who was kind of too young to have many interactions with the military. Their correspondence across the wars shows two generations experiencing distinctly different encounters with American soldiers, demonstrating a change in attitudes towards Jews and among them in response to it, which reflects the changes in American attitudes towards the Jewish people during the interwar years on the whole. During the First World War, the most persistent anti-Jewish claim was that Jewish men evaded service. So Jews who are already enlisted in the military were less inundated by claims of Jewish weakness or unsuitability for army life or accusations of malingering, since those in active service had already disproved them somewhat just by being present, at least as individuals, so they got less grief from their comrades on that point. When Bernard did write home to his family about his comrades' anti-Semitism during the First World War and the Mexican expedition, he wrote in broken Yiddish to try to keep his profile low and under the radar of military censors when he talked about those experiences. He didn't hide his Jewish identity. In fact, he made it a priority to ensure that Jewish soldiers around him had access to Jewish services and holiday celebrations. And before Jewish chaplains arrived to Europe where he was stationed during the First World War, he worked to inform families of Jewish soldiers killed in action where their grave sites were and make sure that they had a Star of David instead of the standard cross on their grave markers. And that's what this picture of him is showing. But it's clear from his writing that he did experience anti-Semitism. It just wasn't de rigueur to talk about it. When he was given a promotion to a position of power among his men, he wrote to his brother, Joi will ich en grieben de goyim, meaning he would rub his new position in the faces of his non-Jewish comrades. One reason he may have wanted to stay quiet about his experiences with anti-Semitism in the army was that those who vocalized accusations of anti-Semitism in the military were often met with recriminations about oversensitivity. Even during the Second World War, though it's certainly understandable to be sensitive at that point given the situation of world Jewry. And this is something that his son, Herbert, certainly experienced. Herbert didn't code his language, perhaps because of the Jewish interest in the war, the Jewish lives at stake. He was much more open in his correspondence about accusing his comrades of anti-Semitic prejudice. But he also found it difficult to advance, despite his successes in each of his positions, which reflected trends in the American military of not promoting Jews to high-ranking positions, though, of course, there were exceptions. In his early days of service, he rose through the ranks from private to corporal, and Herbert experienced very little anti-Semitism in the training camps. He wrote to his father, quote, "Some of the men resent Jews, but I've had no trouble so far. Most of them don't think I am, and at times make remarks. But when you figure the average mentality of the American army is that of a 9-year-old, one takes pity on them," unquote. But only a few months later, this bravado started to wane, and he confessed to his father that he was being treated poorly by his comrades in arms. He explained that of the 7 non-commissioned officers in his platoon, quote, 5 are real Jew haters and 1 partial, the other too stupid to know. He added, they know I'm Jewish, but they all think I'm only part due to their ignorant ideas on what a Jew is supposed to look like and act, unquote. Some Jewish soldiers found it more difficult to dispel stereotypes about themselves. Others, like Herbert, tried to change their comrades' views by performing admirably. And some attempted to change views by more aggressive means, like fighting other soldiers in their platoons. Another soldier, Morris Eisenstein, after being mocked for being Jewish, attacked a sergeant in his platoon and, quote, kicked the daylights out of him. After that, he explained, all of a sudden, everybody was my buddy. It struck me in reading these testimonies that tension and even fighting between Jews and non-Jewish soldiers broke out perhaps even more on the European front, because many of their comrades blamed American Jews for dragging the United States into the war. They were bitter at their Jewish comrades for having to be there at all, something which nearly a century of criticism of American Jewish leadership during the war for not pushing harder to save European Jews would certainly disagree with. Reaching his limit of anti-Semitic slander on this topic, one Jewish veteran's testimony recalled fighting a fellow soldier in a foxhole and yelling for him to just, quote, go over and join Hitler's army, unquote. And apparently the offending soldier was so completely dumbstruck by the seeming oversensitivity of his Jewish comrade, which really shows in many ways how ingrained not only anti-Semitism was, but the assumption that it was a fine thing to voice. A good number of Jews in the armed forces never went to Europe at all, of course, serving in the Navy and fighting in the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. And these soldiers had little to no contact with or impact on the war against Nazi fascism in Europe. This didn't mean, however, that the Navy was free of anti-Semitism or the claim that Jews somehow benefited from American involvement in the conflict. Similar stories can be found in recollections of those serving in the Pacific theater as well. In a clipping from an armed forces periodical that Herbert sent his father during the war, an anti-Semitic diatribe from a soldier asked outright if the United States joined the war, quote, solely to liberate the Jews, unquote, and accused those placing memorial stones depicting a Star of David at the mass graves of Dachau of, quote, trying to illustrate to the Germans that the Jews are supermen and that the Star of David will replace the swastika, unquote. We might assume that although Jewish soldiers experienced anti-Semitism on the European front, on naval ships in the Pacific, and in training camps in the United States, maybe once soldiers had entered the Nazi concentration camps as liberators, they might have been more sympathetic to their Jewish comrades, but this was not the case. Anti-Semitic actions weren't rare among camp liberators at all. When asked, nearly all Jewish World War II veteran interviewees responded with firsthand knowledge and experience of anti-Semitic actions by individuals or institutions within the American Armed Forces, and liberating troops were no exception. It's not entirely surprising that soldiers took it out on one another. Emotions ran high after observing the horrors of Nazi brutality firsthand. Bearing witness to the terrors of the camps affected soldiers in varying ways. Some found themselves suddenly frightened by their own racial prejudice, which they reconsidered after their experiences on the front and came home resolved to have a new respect for all people, regardless of race, religion, or background. And that's certainly an embraced popular narrative. But others harbored beliefs that Jews were very much responsible for the war, and that, compounded with their own trauma, merited retaliation of some kind. Individual reactions aside, the experience of liberating concentration and death camps changed those soldiers who participated. The wide range of actions taken by soldiers immediately following liberation attests to the complexity of that experience. A small percentage of American liberators were Jewish, and they faced an odd mirror when they liberated surviving Jews from the concentration camps. Jewish American soldiers recognized that their connection to Jewish victims was more than a common humanity, that they were part of the same international religious and cultural community. And they had a particularly complex reaction to the victims that greeted them in the camps, as their feelings of pity and disgust were tinged with recognition and commonality. In April of '45, in his position as Army photographer, Herbert Gorfinkel arrived at Buchenwald as it was liberated by American forces. Though he rarely wrote about those experiences, he reported seeing people enslaved and murdered on a colossal scale. And his faith in his comrades and his country was shaken, given his own experiences on the receiving end of anti-Semitism. He said in a letter to his father, quote, "I always wanted the army, always waved a flag. My hand is starting to get weak. It's drooping a little, but it's still clasping the flag," unquote. He had hoped for a military career, but his experiences changed his path and his desire. He felt that he had been passed over too often because of his Jewish heritage and was mistreated too often by his fellow soldiers. And when he came home, he pursued an alternate career. His father, working a military desk job back in the States, reassured him in his letters of Jewish survival and toughness in the face of adversity. He wrote, quote, "The Jew has survived persecution for centuries and is still here, so overlook the ignorance of those who have not the brains to succeed," unquote. It seems counterintuitive to imagine, knowing what we do, that the soldiers liberating the camps continued to be or even became anti-Semitic, considering their own experiences and what they saw. But the psychological distress of entering the camps prompted a number of anti-Semitic actions against Jews by American soldiers. Some of these soldiers targeted their fellow Jewish American comrades, and some even took action against Jewish camp survivors. Another Jewish soldier, also liberating Buchenwald, explained that he nearly killed a sergeant in his own platoon for tormenting a group of liberated Jews. He said that he had been force-feeding them and shouting insults and slurs at them. And the Jewish soldier was so repulsed that he recounted drawing his gun, pulling back the hammer, and threatening the sergeant's life. Another Jewish liberator, Harry Zaslow from Pennsylvania, experienced anti-Semitism directly following and even during his platoon's liberation of Dachau. Upon opening a train car full of corpses, a fellow soldier told him, quote, "If you're not careful, you're going to be in that boxcar," unquote. Recalling this statement later, Zaslow explained, "He meant that because I was Jewish, I should have been in that boxcar." He explained that some of his fellow soldiers were so entrenched in anti-Semitism that even seeing the camps and all of the suffering inside didn't change their views. Within days of entering the camp, Zaslow, while he was on watch duty, found graffiti in a prison tower which read, "Zaslow is a dirty Jew." "Here's what I felt," he said, quote, "This is the tragedy. We fought the Germans to liberate the country and the Jewish people who were in the camps, and the Germans were our enemies. And now a few American soldiers are my enemies as well," unquote. While Herbert was struggling with anti-Jewish sentiment in his platoon, his sister Ruth, on the home front, also experienced anti-Semitism from American military personnel. In 1944, Ruth wrote in a particularly tense account what a good time she and her two friends had been having with a few white and good-looking sailors, in quotes, white and good-looking sailors, before she had a diverting experience in which the sailors started talking openly negatively about the Jewish people. Frightened, she and her friends left in a hurry before the sailors could realize that their surnames were respectively Gorfinkel, Cohen, and Greenberg. Being even younger at the time, their little sister Sarah was less involved in the correspondence, though letters between Bernard and several schools during the war indicated his trouble in placing her at a good private middle years school, particularly because of student quotas, which were already being reached in the midst of the war while he was trying to get her relocated. Perhaps the largest manifestation of American anti-Semitism during the Second World War, not to do with the military, was the one set in place 2 decades before America joined the war. Between 1921 and 24, a number of immigration restriction acts were set in place, illustrating nativist and anti-Semitic fears about growing foreign and Jewish numbers in the United States, effectively bringing the numbers of Jewish immigrants down from 120,000 a year in 1921 to roughly 10,000 a year by 1925 and all the way up until the war began. The intended consequences of these laws and the quota system they enacted, based on nation of origin, set up the United States to refuse entry to the poor and huddled masses they had previously welcomed. The perhaps unforeseeable consequence was that it did so in a way that enabled them much more easily to refuse refugees during the upcoming conflict and to send away Jews to return to a fate far worse than those crafting the immigration legislation of the 20s could have imagined. there was no special condition or legislation at the time for refugees, meaning those who were attempting to flee to the United States as a means of refuge, but not for permanent residency. And the American press talked about this desperate need of Jewish refugees. It was a known situation that they were being targeted, particularly cruelly, even if the degree of their murder was not yet known. But importantly, there was no legislation to help them. Only the system set in place, which applied to all migrants. There were also those who feared Jews, pretty ironically, as a fifth column, a group of migrants coming from a nation currently at war with the US. Such a population is always seen as a threat, even in this case, in which the group itself was the primary target of persecution from their own nation. In a popular opinion poll in 1938, after Kristallnacht, Americans were asked if they believed that more persecuted Jewish exiles should be allowed to come live in the United States. Only 21% believed that they should, though only 6% said that they approved of Nazi treatment of Jews. So 94% of Americans didn't want to behave like Nazis towards the Jews, but nearly 80% were also not willing to live around more of them. In 1940, after Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, an American public opinion poll showed that only 7% of citizens wanted America to enter the war. Though they disbanded after America did enter the war, the America First Committee, pushed by Charles Lindbergh, and boasted nearly 1 million members. And they denounced Jews in the United States, particularly Lindbergh did, as war agitators. And he pushed isolationism, including anti-refugee sentiment. The photo on the top left, as many of you know, I'm sure, is one of the most famous cases of refusing Jewish refugees, the MS St. Louis, a passenger ship which left from Hamburg, taking nearly 1,000 Jewish passengers to Cuba, where they found that their landing permits had been canceled and they were denied entry. In 1939, the combined immigration quota for Germany and Austria was 27,370 and was quickly filled. Actually, there was a several years long waiting list at that point. So without altering restrictions, the United States could have only granted visas to the St. Louis passengers by denying them to the thousands of German Jews placed further up the waiting list. And regardless of their sympathy for German Jews, the American public continued to favor immigration restriction over their criticism of Hitler's policies towards German Jews and Eastern European Jews. In the end, the passengers were denied entry in both the United States and Canada and were sent back to Western Europe, where through negotiations orchestrated by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands each admitted a percentage of passengers before Germany invaded. In the end, 254 of the St. Louis passengers ended up dying as victims of the Holocaust. And this was an atypical story because about 111,000 refugees arrived in New York between March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, and October of 1941, when Germany banned emigration out. The next time a ship of Jews was turned away, in 1941, the SS Kwanzaa, this time turned away from Mexico, American protests, lobbying, and even civil suits against the shipping company ended with the passengers eventually disembarking in the United States. So the St. Louis was a uniquely terrible case. What was typical was American discomfort at bringing Jewish refugees in. Even at the end of the war, in December of 1945, over 50% of those in an American poll believed that we should let fewer Europeans into the country than before the war. And of those, about a third of those believed that no Jews should be granted entry at all. As much of the American story of anti-Semitism that we covered today as a result of nativist beliefs and the un-Americanness of the Jewish minority, American Jews faced a new challenge when, in the aftermath of the war and the Holocaust, the State of Israel was established. It was a pivotal moment in many ways for Jewish America, just as they breathed a sigh of relief for the existence of a Jewish nation and homeland as an option for the refugees of Europe, who would be allowed to relocate to the land of Palestine after years of living as displaced persons. They were finally faced with the reality of a previously unfounded accusation against Jews that they had loyalties to multiple nations. The lecture that I'll be giving here next month will in many ways pick up where this one is about to leave off. I'll continue to examine the Jewish American experience as part of this larger story and the creation of the Jewish state and the adoption of its existence into American life and identity in the decades that follows. And that's where we're going to leave off. After fighting so hard for so long against accusations of dual loyalty, the Jews in America suddenly also had a homeland to be potentially loyal to outside of the United States. And again, after fighting so hard and so long against assumptions of Jewish weakness and accusation of Jewish aversion to conflict, the Israeli state quickly became embroiled in conflict and in many ways celebrated for its military prowess and robust physical training. So I hope you'll come back to join us for that conversation, because I do think it will be an interesting one. I'll be delighted to hear all of your questions and comments. And I also want to say, before we move on to the Q&A period, that much of what I covered here, particularly the long history of Jewish military involvement and the various gendered manifestations of anti-Semitism in the United States over the 20th century, is going to be covered in my upcoming book, which Rachel mentioned at the beginning, Carrying a Big Shtick, to be released in early 2024 through Wayne State University Press. And with that, I will pass the baton back to Rachel. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That was fascinating, and I feel like there's so much more to talk about. Thank you for giving such a compact and very full talk, and we'd love to hear more from you. I do want to remind folks in the audience to type in questions into your Q&A panel. Before we get to the Q&A, I just want to mention, as Miriam just mentioned, we do have a couple of talks next month that we hope you'll join us for. On May 18th, she gives the final presentation in a three-part series looking at American Jewish life in the first half of the 20th century. And that program, as you can see here, is Israel as We, Jewish Americans and the New Nation State. Exploring the historical context of the creation of Israel in 1948 and its impact on mid-century American Jewish identity and life. On May 25th, American Ancestors presents Getting Started in Lithuanian Family History Research. Fascinating and important how-tos for doing genealogy of your Lithuanian family history. We hope you'll join us again for these. And you can find out more and register at jewishheritagecenter.org/events. So please do send in some questions for Dr. Mora. I will start with a couple of questions. I'm frankly stunned by your details about the liberators and the camps, and how rather than inspiring compassion and insight to this horrible experience and to what American Jews and just, Jewish persecution in general, has caused, in fact, it seems to have deepened anti-Semitic feelings. I'm really stunned by that. And I guess I just ask, did those soldiers carry that back with them? I mean, do we know anything about whether that, did that abate? Or did they bring that back and it was, it's unspeakable. Sorry, but do we know anything from later correspondence about that dynamic?
Yeah, I can speak to that somewhat. I agree. When I began looking into testimony of soldiers who had been liberators, I was also very surprised. I expected much more of the kind of favored narrative that they saw this and came back, determined to desegregate the military, and and that it was this very unifying experience. And I think that for as I mentioned, I think for a lot of soldiers it was. And most of the testimony that I found that attest to this kind of opposite reaction and the strengthening of anti-Semitic feelings and, taking things out on Jewish comrades and on survivors, most of that comes from from liberators who have given testimony, like oral testimony, to Holocaust-related projects. So it's not them talking about their own anti-Semitism, it's people who are not just Jews, but other liberators as well, who are willingly and voluntarily talking about their experiences. So they're talking about others. So how much those, I can attest a little bit to what they talked about their experiences being after the war. And several of them, as I mentioned, said, that it really opened their eyes to how bigoted they had been, which was particularly interesting because, especially among the, Christian white liberators who had given testimony, they said things like, they were treating our Jewish boys so badly, and it was so shocking because of everything that we'd seen, and our Jewish boys were so weak to begin with. So while they were also like perpetuating the same stereotypes while speaking out in defense of Jewish soldiers, and some of it, the kind of retaliatory actions, like those that the from Harry Zaslow's testimony, the sergeant, I think he was talking about, his name was Cooley, and he was saying that that he was berating and force feeding these camp survivors. I think much more often what we hear about is retaliatory actions against Nazis, because those are stories that people are not only more comfortable hearing, but which liberators were more comfortable telling. And a lot of those stories include, white liberators, and in some cases, African-American liberators, capturing Nazis and then handing them over to their Jewish comrades specifically for vengeance, saying, oh, we want to watch Jewish Americans beat up these former camp guards. So there's a lot of really interesting reactions in the testimonies, and it kind of goes in a lot of directions. As far as, bringing the anti-Semitism back, I can't imagine that if their experiences there didn't make them more sympathetic, that much following that would. But that's conjecture.
And how about on the home front? So those people who were on the home front who did not see the camps, of course, the information did start coming back. But was there any sort of, evolving understanding and sensitivity to, American Jews, if not European Jews, from the war?
It's a good question. And a very difficult one to answer, I think, partially because so much was happening at once. Americans on the whole knew more than people like to think about what was going on in Germany, but still at the end of the war, the liberation photos that were coming back were shocking and telling, and people were learning all kinds of things that they didn't want to know, which would arguably make them more sympathetic, aside from the fact that at the same time you have the images and stories coming in from Jews fighting against British troops, Jewish displaced persons trying to get to Palestine, and then those trying to get to the United States. So there's really kind of not conflicting stories, but complicating stories on all sides. So even Americans that were sympathetic to Jewish victims were also, I think, kind of frightened of what was going to happen, not what was going to happen to the survivors, but what would become of them, whether they would make it to the United States, whether Jewish American lobbying would be more successful to get new immigrants into the States, given, what we learned from camp liberation photos and everything. And then the state of Israel, immediate conflict. So, I think everything was very complicated. Not a very clear answer, but.
Well, it was a very complicated, condensed period of history with a lot going on. Let's see, we have a couple of comments and questions. Cerise says, my father wrote a memoir about World War II. He was an infantryman who fought in France and Belgium, and he includes experiencing anti-Semitism in the army. He was quoted in Deborah Moore's book, G.I. Jew. Have you used Moore's book and the film that was based on it in your research?
I have. I loved the film. I thought that the interviews they got with like Mel Brooks, and it was really a wonderful film. And the book is excellent. Deborah Moore was a reader on my book while it was still in its dissertation stages. And it's a really excellent book. It's created off of a series of interviews, which were really excellent, and it's put together very, very well and is very accessible. I think that I think that liberator stories tell a very different, one of the things I liked about Deborah's book is that or Dr. Mora's book, sorry, is that it also covers Jews who were in the Navy, which is, I think, was a very different experience. As I mentioned, my grandfather was in the Navy, and he described, and from Boston actually, and he described his experiences as being, the more lighthearted side we hear about, that he felt bonded with his comrades more so. At least that's what I remember. And I liked that Deborah Moore's book kind of covered more of that. So yes, I did use the book in my research. There was I'm trying to remember, there was a rhyme in it that was going around in the Navy, something about, who's like the first American woman to lose a son, last name, McKinney or something. And the first, it was like the first Jew to profit from it, Nathan Goldstein or something like that. So they talk about how these kind of anti-Semitic rhymes and stories are passing even through the Navy, where the Jewish conflict wasn't so central. So I thought that was very interesting.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question. This is a little, maybe a sort of side topic, but can you speak to the relationship between Jewish soldiers and African-American soldiers during World War II?
I can somewhat. I can tell you that some of the liberators who I quote in my book, although I don't think I actually quoted them today, were from African-American liberators who were not fully integrated. And I mean, there's elements of this part of military history that are, I think, really shameful. The blood banks weren't integrated for decades after this, I believe. So, I mean, there was still lots of segregation. But I think, sorry, the question specifically was, I was about to go off on a tangent, but remind me, it was specifically about their experiences as liberators or with Jews?
Just being along side by side, relationship between Jewish soldiers and African-American soldiers during World War II.
The one that comes to mind was an oral history that I used, which I think is available online through Steven Spielberg's organization and the Shoah Foundation, I think. But it was a African-American liberator who told his story as being like he was so repulsed and appalled, and he had a difficult time interacting with Jewish comrades after seeing camp victims. One of them, he told a story about, seeing an adult man who had just been liberated, like defecating in the street, and that it was hard to think of them as human, and it made it difficult for him to interact with his Jewish comrades. But that's the only story that particularly comes to mind. But they would make a really interesting study. Actually, that question would make a really good project on its own.
So I'd love to come back to the Jewish war veterans and the, any Jewish military sort of entities. Did they advocate for changes in the military after this experience? Were there changes that came down the pike following this? And there's another question here in the similar vein. In light of the World War II Jewish servicemen experience of prejudice, did anything change immediately after the war within the service branches to alleviate the Jewish stereotypes and discrimination? So were there any policies that came out of this?
Policies? No, I don't think so. If whoever asked this question has interest in reading up more on it, there's a Joseph Mendersky book on Jews in the military that I strongly recommend. I'm sorry, I'm looking for it on my shelf so I get the title right, but maybe Ginevra can pull it up. I think the Jewish Threat or something like that. But it's a very good book. And he talks about the Jewish experience in the military. I don't think there were any dramatic changes. I think that some of as far as the Jewish war veterans were concerned, their attitude, and I hope this came across in some of the quotes of their statements that I read. Their attitude was very much, there's nothing to disprove, because Jews are just like everyone else. Jews fight, Jews are brave, Jews join up, Jews do their duty, Jews are patriots. And so they never lobbied for different treatment in the military, because their whole thing was they kept publishing these things. Even mid-war, they would publish, as the Jewish Welfare Board did the same thing, kept publishing these reports of Jewish valor before all the numbers even came in. That's how determined and how quick their turnaround needed to be. In 1942, they did it. In 1918, before the war ended in Europe, they did this. They published these numbers, like, look how many Jews are fighting. But they didn't lobby for change. Their push was for changing public opinion. But things did change after the Second World War in terms of how Jews were viewed. And I would argue it's as much because of what had come to public knowledge about the Holocaust as anything else. But images of Jews, two dominant, and this is something I talk about a lot in my book, so feel free, Rachel, to jump in if I'm ranting too much. But two kind of dominant new images of Jewish men emerge on the heels of the Second World War. One comes out of Palestine, which is this sudden, incredibly masculine Jewish figure that has never arguably, it existed in modern history, which is this, man with military prowess who tills the field, who, forces the desert to bloom through sheer willpower, right? This very masculine image. And then at the same time, these walking skeletons, wandering out of Europe at the end of the war. So you've got kind of these two very different images, which really confuse any progress that people like the Jewish war veterans had made towards normalizing the image of Jewish men in America. So it gets complicated after that. But I can say that in the Korean War, for example, and in the Vietnam War, especially when the draft was instituted, Jewish men served just like everyone else. But by then, the armies were much more integrated. So that did change dynamics as well.
We have time for just one or two more questions. Robert asks, have you done any research on Jewish soldiers who were POWs under the Nazis?
I have not.
Okay.
I have not, but it's a really interesting question.
Okay. There's a whole other conversation, I think, to be had about, and you mentioned the sort of tug of war between the conflict between the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the Jewish war veterans. And that brings up the question of Jewish observance while in the military. in the Jewish Heritage Center's archives, we have some incredible photos of seders held, in a military tent during the war. But, is there anything you could quickly say about how willing Jewish soldiers were to practice their Judaism, or were they tamping that down in the face of the anti-Semitism?
That's a really interesting question. And I think, well, obviously, like all things, I think it really varies person to person. Most of the kind of sources we have are, you may have noticed, I said several times, self-describing Jews.
Yes.
It's kind of how I list numbers, because those who want to pass as non-Jewish are obviously not, and it's a voluntary, you opt in. When you're filling out your military forms, you can choose to say so or not. So, some lists of Jewish veterans have been made, and this is a whole other conflict. For example, a book just came out on the Jewish Civil War, which I think you had a talk with Adam Mendelsohn, and one of the issues of the archive that collects this information about Jewish Civil War soldiers is, how do we identify their Jewishness? Can we assume that a surname that is typically Jewish, if they're a Cohen, if they're a Levi, if they're a Steinberg and Golden, whatever, can we assume that they're Jewish? So that's kind of a tough question too. But I think in the holdings that we have, particularly at the Jewish Heritage Center, there are families who have voluntarily given these documents, their correspondence, their photographs. So there are people who were very much self-identifying as Jewish. And most of them, in all of the conflicts that I've done research into, they are celebrating Jewish holidays. Some of the most interesting, I think, collections, I'm trying to remember, and you can jump in, Rachel, if you remember his name, but there's another collection, Minnie and...
Oh, Minnie and William Marcus.
Thank you, the Marcus collection, which is wonderful, and also World War I. And, you know, he talks about, as does Bernard Gorfinkel, talks a lot about how the Jewish boys stick together. And when they're in France, they're connected to Jewish communities there through family members in Boston who get in touch with people in Europe, and they, you know, and they find them Jewish homes to, like, you know, so they can, you know, eat by a nice Jewish girl for Shabbat, and they can do, like, you know, so they can visit people on Rosh Hashanah, and some of the places have no Jewish communities, so they formed their own. But during the First World War, there was no Jewish chaplaincy. So you can see through these accounts, and particularly Bernard Gorfinkel's, because he was so determined to be present and Jewish, you can really see how they build community amongst themselves before they get Jewish chaplains who are assigned to their areas, and, you know, who are actually a branch of the military, which they hadn't been. And the Jewish chaplaincy documents, by the way, for those who are interested, are held, and I think are now largely available online, and are held through the American Jewish Historical Society in New York. So you can view those Jewish chaplaincy records and see kind of how that organization was established, and then how they dealt with the situation of liberating camps, which is another particularly interesting story, because they have to provide services for these displaced persons and help them connect to Jewish communities that they might have family members left in around the world and in the United States. And, you know, so those Jewish chaplains really had their work cut out for them pretty much as soon as they were officially there.
There's so much more to discuss, and we'll just have to pick it up again on May 18th. There are some questions about you know, various attitudes and beliefs just after the war about Jews, and some of that might be answered in Dr. Mora's next talk about you know, the creation of the State of Israel and how that impacted American Jewish practice and identity. So again, we do hope that you will join us on May 18th once again. So thank you so much, Dr. Miriam Mora. That was fascinating. We could keep going, but we want to be respectful of people's evenings. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us for this, this program. We do ask, as you leave the program, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. We ask that you take a minute to fill it out, as your feedback is valuable to helping us develop further programming. And I do invite you to learn more about the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. I want to mention that this free program was made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and to New England Historic Genealogical Society, American Ancestors, from people all over the world. So we would love to ask you to please consider making a donation of your own to support our educational and archival work. Thank you so much. We hope you'll join us again for our programs next month. And until then, goodbye and have a nice evening.